We try to factor this. Our first guess would be x plus 5 times x plus 5. Restart. So this is a video on how to solve for the roots of a function, a quadratic function in particular, when the roots are complex. Okay, so we can always, or well, in general, it's easy to use factoring to find the roots, but it doesn't work for every solution. So you can always find your roots by completing the square or by doing the quadratic equation. For me, usually I think that the quadratic equation is easier to deal with. So that is what we want to do. So to find the roots of our function, we want to start off with the quadratic equation, which if you guys remember is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and all of that is over 2a. Okay? So in my equation here, I have this, remember that quadratic equations are generally in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. In this case, my a is equal to 1. There's a 1 here, even though you don't see it. My b terms, since we don't even see the x here, they don't even give us the x, we know that b equals 0. There are 0 x's there, and that's why they don't appear. So b equals 0, and c clearly equals 25. Okay, so we have this now, and that means that we can plug everything into our quadratic equation. Remember that when we do this, we are technically setting this equal to 0, okay? Because we were trying to figure out the x's that cause this function to equal 0. So I'm going to continue now. So x equals negative b is 0, so 0 plus or minus the square root of b squared. B squared is 0 squared, so that's just 0. 0 times 0 is 0. Minus 4 times a is 1. C is 25. I'll simplify that later. And then 2a, a is 1, so we're going to say that that's 2. Okay, so now I'm going to keep on simplifying. I know that this is equal to 0 plus or minus the square root of, so I have a 0 goes away here, so I have a negative something, and I have 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 25 is 100, if you do that on your calculator, or you can see in your head. So I get 0 plus or minus the square root of negative 100 over 2. Okay? Now we need to factor our square root here so that we can start pulling things out. We can already tell that we would have an issue normally on your calculator. If you try to plug that in, it will give you an error because it does not know how to calculate negative numbers. But after watching the imaginary numbers video, hopefully you do, or at least are starting to understand that we can do that. So if I do this, I'm going to say that it's 0 plus or minus. Now if you remember with square roots, we can split them apart based off of what's inside. So I can say that negative 1 is here, and then I also have a square root of 100. Okay? So remember that that is just splitting up the term, so I can split this up into negative 1 times 100, and then with square roots you can split them apart. And this is all still over 2. So if I continue down here, from over here, I get 0 plus or minus. Now the square root of negative 1, if you remember, I squared is negative, I squared is negative 1. So I'm going to replace this negative 1 with an I squared. So 0 plus or minus the square root of I squared, and then the square root of 100, you guys know that, is just 10. So the square root of 100 equals 10, so I'm going to write 10 over here, and eventually I'll move it over here. This is still all over 2. Now if you guys remember, now that we have I squared inside the parentheses, taking the square of something and then taking the square root of it are inverse operations, which means they cancel each other. So I end up with 0 plus or minus. I'm going to move the 10 out in front since it's multiplication, and I can do that. So this square root of I squared is just I, so I get 0 plus or minus 10I over 2. And so now 0 goes away, so I get 0, technically it's 0 divided by 2 plus or minus 10I over 2. This is 0, so we go away. And our final answer is x equals plus or minus 5i. That is our answer. So if you come to a situation where you have a negative number underneath this square root, you are going to end up having a complex number and maybe a purely imaginary number as a root. You should know that that is okay. It might happen. You won't see many of these problems probably in this course, but it is something that is possible in mathematics. So the factors, if you wanted to end up factoring it, if you know that positive 5i and negative 5i are the roots, the factors of this equation would actually be x minus 5i, x plus 5i. Those are the factors.